Why, hello there, and welcome to the final installment in my look into the first post-OGL scandal 1D&D Dungeon & Dragon playtest packet. As I've been reminding everyone in each of these videos, it's been about a month since Wizards of the Coast tried to deauthorize the OGL, and then when everyone got really upset about it, just kind of sweep the whole thing under the rug and hope that everyone would just kind of forget about it and go back to getting their tickets for the movie and all the tie-in merchandise, renew their D&D Beyond subscriptions, and so far that's kind of been working. Anyway, enough about that. Just, a required reminder about the shady stuff that Wizards of the Coast did whenever I talk about D&D now. Anyway, this playtest covers the Druid, Paladin, and then some miscellaneous stuff, and in the last two videos I covered the Druid and the Paladin, which means this video is miscellaneous stuff. So first and most importantly, Ardlings are officially dead. This wasn't actually in the playtest packet, rather it was in the accompanying video, and announced in the most condescending way possible. Basically stating that the overwhelming negative reaction to the Ardlings was due to, the users just not having the necessary context to understand how great they were. Then adding that later they'll reintroduce them with this context, and then you'll like them. And if you do not see how this unwillingness to drop this stupid reverse tiefling after two failed playtest versions is suggestive of a design philosophy which prioritizes designer ego over player satisfaction, then honestly you're probably beyond help. So basically, this is what I've been saying throughout the entire playtest. They're going to listen to the player feedback until such time as that feedback says something they don't want to hear. Then it's going to be the player's fault for not properly understanding the content. And this should really make you wonder if all of the things that they say they're getting rid of are just being put off until later when they think that, the audience will be a bit more receptive and more reasonable. The general point I'm trying to make here is, when Wizards of the Coast says we are not doing something, they mean for now. But now on to the playtest content, starting with the epic boons, because I mentioned those in the previous two videos. So at level 20, all characters get an epic boon, but they now also get a +2 bonus to one ability score, which can exceed the normal limit of 20 all the way up to 30. And I assume that retroactively applies to all classes, not just the Druid and Paladin, because that would be kinda weird. And the epic boons themselves have been redesigned, or, some of them have been redesigned at least. There are only 3 in this particular playtest packet, but they are the same 3 that were in the Cleric playtest packet. And each one now also provides a +1 bonus to one mental ability score. Presumably, other epic boons will provide +1 bonuses to physical ability scores or other more restricted choices, but overall it does seem like that is a new part of the epic boon design, that they all have this +1 ability score bonus. So first up we have the epic boon of Fate, which in the previous playtest allowed you to add a d10 as a bonus or penalty to the d20 roll of a creature within 60 feet once per long rest. And now allows you to add 2d4 as a bonus or penalty when a creature fails a d20 test within 60 feet. And then you get 8 charges per day, and then regain 2d4 charges after a long rest. And I'm pretty sure there's a typo there. I'm just not entirely sure which is correct. Either you're supposed to be able to add a bonus when they fail a d20 test, or you're supposed to be able to add a bonus or penalty when they make a d20 test. I am going to assume the latter because that is more consistent with the previous version of this feat. And I kind of think the new version is better. Like, sure, you do not have the chance of getting a 9 or a 10, but instead you get a fairly consistent 4 or 5, and also you get to use it 8 times per day instead of once. My real issue is with the rolling to determine the number of charges that get regained after a long rest, because That just kind of seems like an extra thing that you have to do, and as a level 20 caster, there's already a lot of things that you have to do. It's not like balance is really an issue here. These are the epic boons. They're supposed to be the big, epic, broken, feats that nobody's ever going to actually use in gameplay. So, shoot for the moon. Also, it does occur to me that neither version of this feat specifies what kind of action it is to use this ability. Then we have the epic boon of Spell Recall, which in the previous playtest allowed you to, once per day, cast a spell using a 5th level or lower spell slot without expending the spell slot. That one was kinda lame. But now, every time you cast a spell using a slot of level 4 or lower, you roll a d4, and if the result is equal to the level of the spell slot used, it is not expended. So, basically a 25% chance of not expending a spell slot every time you cast a spell, of level 4 or lower. And then we have the epic boon of True Sight, which in the previous playtest gave you True Sight 60 feet, and in this one gives you True Sight 60 feet. So it has been unchanged aside from adding that +1 bonus to one ability score. However, I also do seem to recall holding this one up as an example of how uneven the power level of the epic boons were, because always on True Sight 60 feet versus an extra level 5 spell slot. But now, always on True Sight versus a 25% chance of not expending a level 4 or lower spell slot. It's a little bit more even now. And that is it for epic boons and feats in general. Those are the only ones in this playtest. But now we're going to move on to spells. Banishing Smite still adds 5d10 force damage to an attack, but has been updated to be consistent with the new version of Banishment from the previous playtest. Which means that it now allows for a save at the end of every turn, and only permanently banishes outsiders if they manage to fail a save throughout the entire duration of the spell, which is 1 minute. A thing that is, possible, but not incredibly likely. It is still cast as a bonus action, but now that action is spent after hitting with the attack instead of before making the attack. And the duration is 1 minute instead of concentration up to 1 minute. So basically, you will always get the full duration of the spell, versus the previous version you could cast it, miss with the attack, miss with the attack, miss with the attack, hit with the attack, and then lose those 3 rounds from the full duration of the spell. Also now, instead of banishing the target if they are reduced to 50 hit points or fewer by the attack, they are banished if they fail a charisma save. So this one's not very cut and dry in terms of whether it is an upgrade or a downgrade. Like, it is based on the new version of Banishment, which is objectively worse, allowing for a save every round instead of not doing that. However, the other changes made are better, such as being cast when you hit, so you pretty much do not have a chance of just completely wasting the spell. Also no longer requiring concentration, and being able to affect creatures who are able to take 5d10 plus damage and still have more than 50 hit points remaining. So I cannot say which version of this is better. The actual banishment from the original version was better, but the application of it from the new version is better. Also, you can now cast it at a higher level, increasing the damage by 1d10 for each spell slot level you use above 5. Which doesn't matter for paladins, but because this is now a divine spell instead of a paladin spell, clerics can use it too and then cast it at those higher levels. Blinding Smite has been given a similar treatment. It still adds 3d8 radiant damage to the attack and requires the target to make a con save or be blinded with an additional save at the end of each turn, but now, like Banishing Smite, it is cast as a bonus action on a hit instead of before attacking, and has a duration of 1 minute instead of concentration up to 1 minute. And then can also be cast at higher levels with an extra d8 for each level above 3. And this one, it is objectively better. It has all of the better parts from Banishing Smite without being based around a worse version of a spell. And next up, Find Familiar, which this one's a little complicated. So first, similar to the way that Wild Shape now works, there's just a single stat block for the familiars, and then you get to choose if you have a land, sky, or water familiar who is celestial, fey, or fiend. However, it is a bit less offensive than Wild Shape because, let's be honest here, most of a familiar's attributes are just a formality. They don't really matter that much. The range of the familiar's telepathy and ability to deliver touch spells has been extended from 100 to 120 feet, which doesn't seem like a big deal until you are trying to use it at 105 feet. You can still see and hear through your familiar senses, but now it is a magic action. Still yet to see a reason why that is a necessary distinction instead of a action. Also, now it lasts until the end of your next turn instead of the beginning of your next turn. So presumably that means you can use it continuously, simply using the action again to maintain it instead of having it expire and then be reactivated on each of your turns. Also, the specification that you are blind and deaf to your own senses while using this ability has been removed. So presumably you don't have to worry about what's going on and check in every round with your body. The familiar now acts on your initiative, but still has its own actions, which is much more convenient than having to deal with 2 initiatives, or much more likely just delaying the familiar until your turn. And now the familiar can also attack if you use a reaction to command them to, although that attack only does 2 damage. And they still disappear when reduced to 0 hit points, dismissed, or when you die, but now also have an ability that lets them disappear off into an extra dimensional space with 1 hit point when they are reduced to 0 hit points, for an hour or until they are called back with a magic action. And you can no longer temporarily dismiss them, but as I just said, you can just kind of make them go away for an hour. With violence. And finally, you can cast the spell at a higher level. Doing so adds the level of the spell slot used to the familiar's AC, hit dice, and damage. And then Find Steed gets a similar treatment, having the Otherworldly Steed stat block instead of using the actual monster stats. The Otherworldly Steed still has 1 mile telepathy with the caster, but does not gain the ability to understand a language, so you can talk to the horse, but the horse can't understand everyone else, so they can no longer spy for you. The steed no longer has the ability to be affected by any spell that you cast on yourself, but now any healing spell cast on you of 1st level or higher also affects the steed if they're within 5 feet. And that's another one where it could go either way, depending on what spells you're casting on yourself versus what healing spells are being cast on you. One version or the other could be better. The steed also has an attack that deals 1d8 plus spell level damage, either radiant, psychic, or necrotic, depending on which type of creature you have selected. And they also have an additional once per long rest ability, also based on the creature type. So, Healing Touch for Celestials, which allows you to heal a touched creature 2d8 plus spell level hit points, Fey Step for Fey, which allows you to teleport 60 feet, and Fell Glare for Fiends, which allows you to frighten a creature within 60 feet. And then, of course, like the familiar and the previous version, when reduced to 0 hit points or dismissed, it just kind of poofs away. However, it notably no longer states that you have to summon the same steed the next time you cast the spell, which was a requirement in the 5th edition version. And as with the familiar, casting at a higher level adds to AC, hit dice, damage, and healing, and also when cast with a level 4 or higher spell slot, the steed can have a fly speed. And shockingly, I actually like this. Using the generic stat block instead of the actual statistics for Wild Shape was, a bit of an oversimplification for something that was a core class feature, and using the generic stat block for the familiar kind of seems unnecessary because you don't really need a familiar stats that often. But this is kind of like a happy medium where using the generic stat block versus the fairly narrow selection of rideable animal stats is an overall positive version of the experience. So you have a fairly simple stat block, you get that neat little ability, but then also you can effectively level up your steed by casting the spell at a higher level. Which, once again is a thing that now that clerics have access to the spell, they can do a bit more effectively. But overall, it makes it a more useful ability that you can use for a longer time. And moving on to Glimmering Smite, which I believe is a new 2nd level spell, which, like the other Smite spells, is a bonus action cast when hitting with an attack, which adds 2d6 radiant damage plus 1d6 for each slot used above level 2, and also makes the target radiate bright light in a 5-foot radius, and grants advantage to all creatures on attacks versus the target, and has a duration of concentration up to 1 minute. And this is overpowered. Advantage on attacks for all creatures against the target for 10 rounds at the cost of concentration and a level 2 spell is kinda ridiculous. Especially considering this is a thing a cleric can now do at level 3. Also, it says, after hitting a creature with a weapon or unarmed strike, with no specification that it is a melee weapon, so maybe you can use it with a bow. Unless the range of self means that you must be physically connecting yourself to the target via your weapon. And if that is the case, it is probably the kind of thing that should be specified. Searing Smite is exactly the same, other than being cast on a hit instead of before the attack. Spare the Dying now restores 1 hit point to the dying target instead of stabilizing them. We'll get more into that later. Staggering Smite and Thundering Smite are exactly the same, aside from, like all the other smites, now triggering on a hit instead of before making the attack, and having their duration changed to instantaneous because neither of those have an ongoing effect, and no longer require a duration. And also add an additional d6 for each higher level spell slot used. And Wrathful Smite, basically the same, other than casting on a hit instead of before the attack, and the target now gets a save to end the frightened condition at the end of each turn, instead of needing to use an action to make the save, which, makes it a less effective spell, but also requiring an action to make a save was kinda weird. And that is the spells, and you know what, I thought this was going to be a short video. It is not a short video. But now on to the updates. The changelog is back, but apparently the changelog now only covers the items in the rules glossary, not the spells and feats and stuff. But it does actually provide specifics on what was changed, so I'm gonna say this is an upgrade. The following items have been removed from the glossary, which means that they now default to the 5th edition Player's Handbook versions of those rules. Ability check, attack roll, climbing and swimming, dash, hidden condition, jump action, slowed condition, and special speeds. I do not remember how any of those were different than the base 5th edition versions, but it doesn't matter anymore. Now let's check out the revised entries, which, as I mentioned earlier, it actually states how they are revised, which is very convenient for making videos on them for the internet. The D20 test has had the rule removed where you gain a heroic inspiration when you roll a 1, which is good because that was a stupid rule. Difficult terrain now excludes spaces occupied by allies because presumably your allies, they get out of the way and let you go by. As well as changing the specification from furniture of size small or larger to one size smaller than you or larger, which means that for a small creature, tiny pieces of furniture are now difficult terrain, and for a large creature, small pieces of furniture are no longer difficult terrain. The attack action now very specifically states what is allowed as part of the equipping or unequipping a weapon before or after each attack. And apparently that includes drawing, picking up, or retrieving a weapon from a container, and then the reverse of those things for unequipping. And I have thoughts on this, but man, this video is going way longer than I wanted it to be, and I don't have time for a rant right now. Fly speed now specifies that you fall if you have the incapacitated or prone condition, or if your fly speed is reduced to 0, versus the previous version which said that you would fall if you had the incapacitated or restrained condition. Both of them stating that this doesn't apply if you have the hover trait. And A, I'm not sure how you can be prone while flying, and B, why did they remove restrained as a thing that would make you fall while you're flying? I feel like something here is wrong, but I don't know what. The grappled condition now specifies that moving a creature that you have grappled costs double movement instead of imparting the slowed condition, presumably because there are things that negate the slowed condition that wouldn't really make sense in this context. And also now states that attempts made to escape a grapple are an action instead of just being made at the end of your turn. And, that's one of those things where which version is better depends on if you're grappling someone or if someone is grappling you. Overall, I kind of like having to use your action to try and break the grapple. It just seems thematically more accurate. The help action now applies to both skill and tool proficiencies. The tool proficiencies has been added. Heroic Inspiration is now called Heroic Advantage, and also they still don't know what to do with it. The incapacitated condition now states that you cannot use bonus actions while incapacitated, because D&D players are the special kind who will argue that they should be allowed to use the unarmed strike that you get from Circle of the Moon while unconscious, because the incapacitated condition does not specify you cannot use bonus actions. Long Rest now specifies that certain abilities are recharged by a long rest, which wasn't really necessary, but also has changed the things that can interrupt a long rest, adding taking any damage and replacing combat with rolling initiative. And I'm not really sure why they have suddenly become so insistent that initiative is only used for combat. Oh, I got it. The virtual tabletop. I guess it doesn't have a way of running initiative out of combat. The section on moving around other creatures now specifies that an ally is not difficult terrain, to be consistent with the other thing that says the same thing. And the section that specified reducing your speed to 0 also reduced any special speeds to 0 now has been expanded to specify that anything that changes your base speed will also apply to special speeds. So for example, if your speed is halved, your climb speed is halved. If your speed is doubled, your fly speed is doubled. Unarmed Strike has been updated to state that the shove and grapple uses no longer require an attack roll, and instead are opposed by a dexterity or strength save. And at first, I was kind of very against this one, and still not sure how I feel about the shove, but it kind of makes a lot more sense for grapple. The sort of thing where like the big strong dude, is trying to hit you and he can't, so he just roar, and that seems to be reflected better in this version of the rules. But now on to the final section of the video, the new entries, which I will be comparing to the same rules from the player's handbook because there is no previous playtest version for me to compare them to, because they're new, like I just said. The dying condition, aside from, some various wording change, seems to suggest that stabilization might not be a thing anymore, which would also explain the change in Spare the Dying. Now, upon making your third death save, you gain 1 hit point, but are still unconscious until such time as you receive healing or medical attention. So basically, it just kind of eliminates that state of being stable at 0 hit points, which also affects the knockout rules, which are now basically the same. When you knock out a creature, you put them in that unconscious at 1 hit point state. Also, it does say on both of those that you begin a short rest when you are put into this state, so that might mean that after an hour you can spend hit dice and get yourself out of that 1 hit point unconscious state, or maybe you can't. That requires clarification. Speaking of which, short rest has been worded a bit more specifically and now has a section on things that can interrupt a short rest, those being taking any damage, casting a spell of level 1 or higher, and rolling initiative. They hate rolling initiative now for some reason. Telepathy, I'm not sure if there are any new rules or slight changes here. It might just be collecting all the telepathy rules and putting them in one entry for convenience. And the unconscious condition now specifies that your speed is reduced to 0, probably for the same reason that they felt the need to specify that an incapacitated creature cannot take bonus actions. And that is it for this particular 1D&D Dungeon & Dragon playtest packet. If you have not seen my videos on the Druid and the Paladin, you can watch them if you would like. If you don't want to watch them, don't. However, I will say there is something coming up in the playtest that's actually worth looking forward to, because there's a little design note stating that in the upcoming Warrior Group classes playtest, they are going to actually explain the new weapon options. If you watch my videos on the previous 2 playtest packets, you may recall me regularly complaining about the fact that it seems like they made some kind of changes to the way weapons are categorized, but didn't actually tell us what those changes are. It was kind of a big part of my whole thing about how poorly organized this whole playtest was, that was a really important piece of information that should have been provided first. It should have been in the 2nd playtest, not the 5th, or, later. They don't say that it's going to be the next playtest, just that Warrior Group playtest is coming up eventually, and will contain the weapon options, which could mean nothing. Like, that's the thing. It doesn't guarantee that there's actually going to be something worthwhile there. But I am going to, I'm going to pretend that there's going to be something worthwhile there, because I gotta have something to look forward to when you make videos about Dungeons & Dragons on the internet. So that's it for this video. I will see you whenever I put out a new video. Probably, like, really, really soon, like tomorrow. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Samuel Gorski, Ranty Mulholland, and Toshirokuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, you can check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos, which either myself or the Cold Heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.